The tires of Rick Bennett's Audi A6 slid across the wet asphalt as he braked abruptly in front of Luminous. The rain falling on New York City that Friday night seemed to conspire against his meticulously calculated schedule. He glanced at his watch. 9:37 p.m. 37 minutes late. Rick detested lateness, especially his own. He adjusted his navy blue tie, grabbed his umbrella and exited the car, handing the keys to the valet with the same efficiency with which he conducted his negotiations. The meeting with the Canadian investors had gone longer than anticipated. They were interested in expanding their partnership with his import company, one of the largest ventures in the sector in New York. Rick smiled discreetly as he shook out his umbrella at the restaurant entrance. The foreigners had been impressed with his presentation, another achievement to add to his extensive success record. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett. Miss Sanders is already waiting for you," said the maitre d', leading him between elegantly decorated tables. Victoria Sanders, 28, model and digital influencer, sat with impeccable posture, absent-mindedly scrolling through her smartphone. Her asymmetrically cut black dress accentuated her tanned shoulders and the slender silhouette that frequently graced advertising campaigns. When she saw Rick, she raised her blue eyes and attempted a restrained smile. 38 minutes, she said, ostentatiously looking at the thin watch on her wrist. "Almost broke my personal waiting record." Rick leaned down and kissed her lightly on the lips. "The Canadians are too meticulous, but it was worth it. We finalized the expansion to Montreal," he replied, sitting down. "Sorry for being late. You look stunning, as always." Victoria smiled, satisfied with the compliment. They had been together for 8 months, long enough for her to understand how Rick's life worked. Business always came first. Punctuality was an occasional courtesy, and compliments were distributed with the same strategic skill with which he closed contracts. "I already ordered the wine." "That Bordeaux you like," she commented, running her fingers through her perfectly styled blonde hair. "Perfect," he replied, opening the menu. Luminous wasn't just one of the most exclusive French restaurants in the city, with a weeks-long waiting list for reservations. It was also a personal landmark for Rick. 4 years ago, in that same environment of soft lighting and carefully selected ambient music, he had celebrated his first wedding anniversary with Lauren. Rick pushed the thought away with the same ease with which he discarded unfavorable business proposals. The past was irrelevant. What mattered was the present, his company growing exponentially, his penthouse on the Upper East Side, his convenient relationship with Victoria, beautiful, discreet, and without complicated emotional demands. "So, the Canadian investors," Victoria began, genuinely interested in his business. It was one of the qualities Rick appreciated in her. She knew how to listen and ask the right questions at the right moments. He began narrating the details of the meeting, gesturing with controlled enthusiasm as he explained the financial projections and international expansion strategy. Victoria observed him with admiration. To her, Rick represented everything she considered success: determination, intelligence, and an impressive ability to get exactly what he wanted. "With this partnership, we'll increase our presence in the North American market by at least 40% next year," he explained, with the contained enthusiasm of someone accustomed to winning. It was at that moment that something changed in the environment. A presence, a subtle alteration in the atmosphere that Rick couldn't immediately identify. He continued talking, but his focus had already shifted to something that seemed out of place, like an experienced investor who senses an unexpected variable in an apparently perfect negotiation. And then he saw her. Lauren. Time seemed to slow down as his eyes registered the scene, his ex-wife in the restaurant's black uniform, carrying a tray with elaborate dishes, dark brown hair tied in a low, functional bun, a face with subtle makeup that couldn't completely hide the fatigue in her almond eyes, and the belly, an advanced pregnancy belly that the uniform couldn't disguise. Rick felt the air slowly escape from his lungs. The phrase he was about to say evaporated, his eyes fixed on Lauren's figure, moving carefully between the tables, serving customers with discreet efficiency. "Rick? Are you okay?" Victoria's voice seemed to come from very far away. He blinked several times, trying to regain his composure. Yes, just remembered something important about the contract, he lied, averting his gaze. But it was too late. Lauren had turned and was now staring at him. Their eyes met across the elegant dining room, and in that instant, 4 years of separation seemed to compress into a single moment of mutual recognition. The tablet Lauren was holding trembled slightly in her hands. For a second, Rick thought she might approach, say something, but she merely looked away and continued her work, heading to another table with a dignity that left him disconcerted. That waitress. "Do you know her?" asked Victoria, always attentive to his reactions. "No," Rick automatically replied. "She just looked familiar." The sommelier appeared at that moment with the wine, providing a welcome distraction, while the man performed the ritual of presenting the bottle and serving the glasses. Rick tried to organize the whirlwind of thoughts. Lauren, pregnant, working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant. The equation didn't make sense. Victoria began talking about an advertising campaign she was negotiating, but Rick merely nodded mechanically. His eyes betrayed his attention, seeking Lauren across the dining room every few seconds. It was when she approached their table, tablet in hand, carefully composed professional expression. "Good evening. Welcome to Luminous. Have you decided?" "What you'll be ordering?" she asked in a controlled voice, looking mainly at Victoria. Rick felt an involuntary contraction in his stomach. Lauren's voice, that same voice that had once filled his home, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with heated discussions, now sounded formal and distant. "We haven't decided yet," Victoria replied, noticing the almost palpable discomfort between Rick and the waitress. "Can you give us a few more minutes?" "Certainly," Lauren replied, still avoiding looking directly at Rick. "I'll be back in a moment." When she walked away, Victoria leaned over the table. "Are you sure you don't know her? Because the tension between you two is almost visible." Rick took a sip of wine, buying time to decide how much to reveal. "She's my ex-wife," he finally admitted, keeping his voice low. Victoria's eyes widened, genuine surprise replacing suspicion. "Your ex-wife? The one you never talk about, working as a waitress and pregnant?" Rick nodded, feeling strangely exposed. In their 8 months of relationship, he had only mentioned Lauren superficially. A marriage that didn't work out, irreconcilable differences, the past that was left behind. Victoria had never insisted on knowing more details, and he appreciated that discretion. "I haven't seen her in 4 years, he explained, twirling the wineglass between his fingers. "Since the divorce." "And she's pregnant," Victoria observed, not as a question but as a statement. Dinner proceeded in a strange atmosphere. Rick tried to maintain the conversation, but his mind was elsewhere. He observed Lauren moving around the restaurant, carrying plates, taking orders, smiling politely at customers. He noticed the fatigue in her movements, the weight of her belly, the way she occasionally rested her hand on her back as if in pain. When Lauren returned to take their orders, the interaction was brief and professional. She kept her eyes on the tablet, efficiently noting the choices of both. Rick, however, couldn't look away. There was something deeply disturbing about seeing her there, serving him, pregnant with another man's child. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, guilt, and an uncomfortable feeling that something was out of place in the perfectly ordered universe he had built for himself after the divorce. "Rick," Victoria called, bringing him back to the present. "You're not here today." "Sorry, it was unexpected," he admitted. Victoria studied him for a few moments, her blue eyes assessing every nuance of his expression. "Do you want to leave?" she asked, with the understanding that surprised him. Rick considered the offer. It would be easier to leave, avoid the discomfort, return to his carefully planned life. But something kept him there, trapped in that moment, in that vision of Lauren, that had destabilized his certainties. "No," he finally answered. "Let's stay." The rest of dinner proceeded like a slow-motion scene for Rick. The food, normally a refined pleasure, seemed tasteless. The conversation with Victoria required a conscious effort, and his eyes, treacherous, continued seeking Lauren across the dining room. When dessert arrived, brought by another waiter, Rick felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of him wanted another brief encounter, another opportunity to decipher the enigma that Lauren had become. Another part just wanted to escape this disturbing situation. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:48 p.m. when Rick parked in the garage of the Monarch building in the heart of the Upper East Side. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle typical of New York nights. During the entire journey back, the silence between him and Victoria had been punctuated only by the sound of the windshield, wipers, and the occasional GPS alert. "Do you want to come up?" Rick asked mechanically when the car came to a complete stop. Victoria turned to him, her scrutinizing eyes evaluating every micro-expression on his face. "I think it's better not to," she replied, with surprising frankness. "You're clearly not. Here, your head is still in that restaurant." Rick didn't try to deny it. He was too pragmatic to waste energy on useless denials. "I need to process what happened," he admitted, running a hand through his carefully cut hair. "It was unexpected." "She seemed surprised to see you too," Victoria observed, adjusting the strap of her designer bag over her shoulder. "What happened between you two anyway? You never told me the complete story." Rick hesitated. He didn't usually talk about the past, especially about Lauren, not because of pain or longing, but because he considered it inefficient to revisit closed stories. "Irreconcilable differences," he replied, using the same generic phrase from the divorce documents. "We wanted different things from life." Victoria studied him for a few more seconds before opening the car door. "Call me when you've processed all this," she said, without hostility, but with a calculated distance. "Good night, Rick." He nodded, watching her walk toward the elevator, her high heels echoing on the concrete of the garage. Victoria was practical, like him. It was one of the qualities he most appreciated in her. Alone in the apartment, Rick poured himself a whiskey and walked to the penthouse balcony. The panoramic view of New York, normally a reminder of his success and achievements, seemed strangely empty that night. The city lights sparkled through the persistent drizzle, creating diffuse halos that blurred the outlines of the buildings. He brought the glass to his lips, feeling the amber liquid gently burn his throat. The image of Lauren remained vivid in his mind. The prominent belly, the fatigue in her eyes, the slightly trembling hands holding the tablet, a stark contrast to the last image he had of her, young, determined, leaving the lawyer's office after the final signature of the divorce 4 years ago. Their marriage had lasted only 2 years, intense at the beginning, with the passion of two ambitious young people conquering New York. It had deteriorated into frequent arguments and prolonged silences. Lauren worked as a marketing executive at a promising agency. Rick was at the beginning of his rise in the world of imports. Both dedicated long hours to work, saw each other little, talked even less. The problems began when Lauren proposed they have a child. Rick resisted, arguing that it wasn't the right time, that they needed to stabilize financially first. But the truth, which he never fully admitted, was that he feared the changes a child would bring to his meticulously organized life. Discussions about the subject became more frequent. Lauren accused him of being cold, calculating, unable to prioritize family above business. Rick retorted that she was being irrational, too emotional, unable to understand the importance of building a solid foundation first. The final blow came when Rick, consumed by an irrational jealousy fueled by stress and long absences, began to suspect that Lauren was cheating on him with a colleague from the agency. There was no evidence, just coincidences and paranoia. But it was enough. The accusations became increasingly bitter, trust crumbled, and divorce seemed the only rational way out. Rick swallowed the rest of the whiskey, feeling the liquid go down hot through his throat. Remembering those days was uncomfortable. He had moved on, built his empire, achieved everything he had always wanted. Lauren had become just a footnote in his success story. Until now. Seeing her pregnant, working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant, challenged the entire narrative he had built for himself about the end of the relationship. In the version he maintained in his head, Lauren would continue her career, perhaps marry again someone more compatible with her desires to start a family. Someone successful, stable, able to give her the comfortable life she deserved. The reality he had seen that night didn't fit into that idealized version, and that disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. He poured himself another finger of whiskey and returned to the balcony. The night was colder now, but Rick barely noticed. His mind was filled with unanswered questions. How had Lauren gone from promising executive to waitress? Who was the father of the child? Why was she working in such an elegant restaurant where she ran the risk of meeting people from her old social circle? His cell phone vibrated in his pants pocket. A message from Charles Reynolds, his partner, reminding him of the meeting with shareholders on Monday. Important meeting. Decisive for the company's future. Rick should be focused, preparing, reviewing numbers and projections, but all he could think about was Lauren. On Sunday, after a restless night of sleep interrupted by confused dreams, Rick did something he never imagined he would do. He returned to Luminous for lunch, alone. He sat at a discreet table in the corner of the dining room where he could observe without being immediately noticed. The menu, which he knew by heart, seemed merely a prop in his hands as his eyes scanned the environment, looking for her. He didn't have to wait long. Lauren emerged from the kitchen, carrying plates to a table near his. The black uniform highlighted her pregnancy belly even more. There were dark circles under her eyes, more visible in daylight. She moved carefully, as if each step required calculation and concentration. "May I help you, sir?" The waiter's voice startled him. Rick placed his order almost without thinking, choosing dishes that would prolong his stay at the restaurant. While he waited, he observed Lauren from a distance. He noticed how she occasionally supported her hand on her back, as if in pain. How her smile for customers seemed rehearsed, professional, different from the spontaneous smile he had known years ago. When their gazes finally crossed, Rick didn't look away. He maintained eye contact across the dining room, trying to decipher what he saw in her eyes. It wasn't anger or resentment, as he expected. It was something more complex, a mixture of resignation, fatigue, and perhaps a trace of wounded pride at being seen in that situation. Lauren was the one who broke contact, turning to serve another table. During the rest of his meal, she carefully avoided his area of the dining room, delegating service to other waiters. Rick left a generous tip and departed, feeling strangely unsatisfied. The brief visual encounter hadn't answered any of his questions. On the contrary, it had only increased his restlessness. In the days that followed, he established a new routine. He had lunch at Luminous whenever possible, sitting at the same table, observing Lauren from a distance. She continued to avoid him, but he noticed small changes in her condition: the growing belly, the more evident fatigue, the increasing difficulty in moving between tables with heavy trays. Victoria called a few times. The conversations were brief, practical. She was busy with a campaign in Milan. He was focused on a new negotiation. Both knew that something had changed, but neither felt the need to discuss the matter directly. In the third week of this strange vigil, Rick finally acted. Seeing Lauren almost trip while carrying a particularly heavy tray, he instinctively stood up, as if to support her. She regained her balance before he arrived, but the gesture didn't go unnoticed. That afternoon, as he left the restaurant, he found her sitting on a bench on the sidewalk, resting during her break. She looked exhausted, with her eyes closed, and her head slightly tilted back. "Lauren?" She opened her eyes, startled. For a moment she seemed to consider getting up and leaving, but gave up. Perhaps out of fatigue, perhaps out of curiosity. "Rick," she simply replied. He hesitated, realizing that he hadn't planned what to say if he actually met her like this, face to face, without the professional barrier of the restaurant between them. "How are you?" he finally asked, feeling the inadequacy of the question as soon as the words left his mouth. An ironic smile briefly crossed her lips. "How do I look?" she retorted, passing her hand over her belly in a protective gesture. "Pregnant and exhausted. Rick nodded, accepting the direct response. He had always appreciated this quality in Lauren, her unflorid honesty, so different from the social games that dominated his corporate world. "May I sit?" he asked, indicating the empty space next to her on the bench. Lauren shrugged, a gesture he interpreted as consent. He sat down, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "You don't seem surprised to see me," he observed. "It's the 4th time you've come for lunch here in 2 weeks," she replied, without looking at him. "The restaurant isn't that big." "You noticed. Hard not to notice when your ex-husband suddenly starts frequenting your workplace." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but neither was it hostile. It was a silence laden with unformulated questions, unshared stories, 4 years of lives following separate paths. "How many months?" Rick finally asked, looking at her belly. 8, Lauren replied, without elaborating. More silence. Rick felt uncomfortably out of his comfort zone. In negotiations, in meetings with investors, at social events, he always knew exactly what to say, how to behave. There, on that park bench, beside the woman who had once been his wife, he felt disarmed. "Lauren, My break is over," she interrupted, checking her watch. "I need to get back." She stood up with some difficulty, supporting one hand on her back. Rick stood up too, instinctively extending his hand to help her, but she discreetly moved away. "I don't need your help, Rick," she said without hostility, just stating a fact. "I've been dealing with this for months, alone." The last word hung in the air between them, laden with meanings that Rick wasn't ready to explore. "See you," she said, turning to re-enter the restaurant. "See you," he replied, watching her walk away. That night in his Upper East Side apartment, Rick did something he hadn't done in years. He researched Lauren, first on social media, discovering that she had deactivated almost all of her accounts. Then, using contacts and resources he normally reserved for due diligence in important negotiations. The results were surprising and disturbing. Lauren had left her job at the marketing agency shortly after the divorce. Since then, she had gone through 3 different jobs, each apparently less prestigious than the previous one. Her last known address was a small apartment in the East Village, very far from the standard of living they had shared. There was no record of marriage, no information about the father of the child, no indication that she was receiving any kind of financial support beyond her own salary as a waitress. The pieces didn't fit. The Lauren he had known was ambitious, determined, with a bright future ahead. How had she reached this point? The most disturbing of all was the growing feeling that somehow he was partially responsible for this downward trajectory. An absurd idea, of course. They had separated 4 years ago. Each had gone their own way. Her choices had nothing to do with him. Still, the image of Lauren pregnant, exhausted, working on her feet for long hours, remained vivid in his mind, provoking a restlessness he couldn't name. When the phone rang, he was startled. It was Charles Reynolds, his partner, reminding him of the importance of the next morning's meeting. The conference room of Bennett and Reynolds Imports occupied half of the top floor of a commercial building on Park Avenue. Through the floor-to-ceiling, glass windows, the city of New York, stretched out in a panorama of concrete and glass under a blue winter sky. 12 executives in impeccable suits sat around the dark wood oval table, attentive to the presentation projected on the screen. Rick, standing at the head of the table, concluded his exposition on the international expansion of the company. The graphs showed ascending curves. The numbers were impressive, the projections ambitious. At any other time, this would be the type of meeting that energized him, that reaffirmed his identity as one of the most promising businessmen of his generation. Today, however, his mind was divided between the corporate present and the figure of Lauren, whom he couldn't push away from his thoughts. With the finalization of the agreement with the Canadians, we estimate revenue growth on the order of 38% in the next quarter, he concluded, clicking to the last slide. Any questions? There was a brief silence, followed by polite applause. The shareholders exchanged satisfied looks. Charles Reynolds, seated at the other end of the table, smiled with approval. "Excellent presentation, Rick," said Charles, standing up. "Gentlemen, I believe we can consider this project unanimously approved." More applause, handshakes, promises of drinks to celebrate. Rick participated mechanically in these rituals, while his mind calculated how long it would take to reach Luminous if he left in the next 20 minutes. "Are you all right?" asked Charles, approaching when the other executives began to disperse. "You seemed a bit distant today." Rick forced a smile. "Just tired. The negotiation with the Canadians was intense." Charles studied him for a moment, not entirely convinced. "Victoria called my wife," he commented casually. "Said you two are taking a break?" Rick imperceptibly stiffened. He didn't like his personal life being a topic of conversation, even with his closest partner. "We're reorganizing," he replied vaguely. "She's in Milan for a campaign." Charles nodded, without insisting. "Well, don't forget the dinner with the Chinese investors on Thursday," he reminded. "We need them fully convinced before we proceed with the operation in Shanghai." "I'll be there," Rick assured, already discreetly checking his watch. 30 minutes later, he parked his car on the side street next to Luminous. The lunch movement was ending. Some executives in suits were leaving, checking messages on their smartphones. Rick waited in the car, observing the service entrance. His new routine almost obsessive, waiting for Lauren to leave after her shift. He had to wait almost an hour before seeing her emerge through the side door, still in her black uniform under a simple coat. She seemed even more tired than in previous days. She walked slowly, one hand supporting her back, the other holding a synthetic leather bag worn from use. Rick got out of the car and approached. "Lauren." She turned, surprised, but not alarmed. Perhaps she had already become accustomed to his sudden appearances. "You again," she commented, with a sigh that mixed fatigue and resignation. "What do you want, Rick? Isn't it enough to observe me during lunch every day?" Her frankness always disarmed him. There were no subterfuges or social games between them, just raw truths that demanded equally direct answers. "I wanted to offer a ride," he replied, indicating the car. "You look exhausted." A flash of hesitation crossed her face. For a moment, Rick thought she would accept. Then her gaze subtly hardened. "Thank you, but no," she replied, adjusting the bag on her shoulder. "I'm fine." "Lauren," he insisted, taking a step forward. "It's evident that you're not fine. At least let me take you home. No commitments, no conversations if you don't want. Just a ride." She studied him for a few moments, as if assessing his true intentions. Finally, a contraction of pain passed across her face, making her press her hand against her back with more force. "All right," she conceded with a sigh. "Just the ride." The journey to the East Village was made in silence. Lauren looked out the window, occasionally indicating a direction when necessary. Rick respected her desire not to talk, but couldn't help noticing how she occasionally closed her eyes, as if trying to control the pain. The building where she lived was a simple construction, without an elevator, painted in a yellow faded by time. Rick parked in front, feeling a tightness in his chest as he imagined Lauren climbing 4 flights of stairs every day, pregnant and exhausted after long hours on her feet. "Thanks for the ride," she said, opening the car door. Can I accompany you up there?" Rick asked hesitantly. Lauren seemed about to refuse, but another contraction of pain made her change her mind. "If you want," she replied without looking at him. The apartment was small but surprisingly cozy. Rick noticed the personal touches that transformed the modest space into a home. Plants in the corners, some framed photographs, colorful cushions on the simple sofa. A stark contrast to his own Upper East Side penthouse, spacious, elegant, and impersonal, decorated by a professional to impress visitors, not to offer real comfort. "Would you like coffee?" Lauren offered mechanically, placing her bag on the counter that separated the living room from the American kitchen. "No, thank you," Rick replied, still observing the environment. His eyes settled on a small crib already assembled in a corner of the living room, white, simple, with a colorful mobile hanging above. Lauren followed his gaze. "It's a girl," she said, breaking the silence. "Sophie." "Sophie," repeated Rick, feeling the name strange on his tongue. "It's a beautiful name." Another moment of silence. Lauren moved to the kitchen, filling a glass with water. Her movements were slow, calculated, as if each gesture required a conscious effort to avoid pain. "How long have you been working at Luminous?" Rick asked, trying to establish some connection. 4 months, she replied, leaning on the counter. "It was the only place that accepted me in this condition." The frankness of the response bothered him. Lauren had never been the type of person who inspired pity, and it was evident that she didn't want his compassion now. "And before that?" "Before that, I worked in a department store, and before that in a smaller advertising agency, and before that, I tried to keep my job at Metric. But it didn't work out," she enumerated with forced calm. "Does that answer your curiosity, Rick? Or do you want to know more details about my fascinating fall after our divorce?" The bitterness in her voice was palpable. Rick felt uncomfortable, out of his element. In business, he always knew exactly how to react, what to say, how to navigate difficult situations. There, facing Lauren's brutal frankness, he felt disarmed. "I didn't come here to judge your life," he said finally. "Then why did you come? What do you want, Rick?" she asked, turning to face him directly. "Were you curious when you saw me pregnant? And working as a waitress? Wanted to confirm if I had really fallen so low after we separated? Or is it just late guilt eating you from inside?" The words hit him like physical blows, not because they were unfair, but because they contained truths he wasn't ready to admit. "I don't know," he admitted, with an honesty that surprised them both. "When I saw you that night, it was as if something didn't fit in my perfectly organized world. I moved on after our divorce, built exactly the life I always wanted. But seeing you like this—" "Like what?" she challenged. "Pregnant? Poor? Working as a waitress?" "Suffering," he completed, holding her gaze. "You're suffering, Lauren. You're exhausted, in pain, working far beyond what you should at this stage of pregnancy. And I can't understand how we got to this point." A flash of vulnerability crossed her face, quickly replaced by a more neutral expression. "We didn't get to any point, Rick. I got here. These are my choices, my life." "And the father of the child?" he asked, unable to contain the curiosity that had consumed him for weeks. Lauren visibly hardened. "That's none of your business. You're alone in this," he insisted, not as a question but as a statement. She didn't respond immediately. For a moment Rick glimpsed again that vulnerability, that breach in the armor of forced independence she maintained. "I'm dealing with it," she finally replied with dignity, "as I've always dealt with everything since we separated." Rick took a step forward, driven by a feeling he couldn't completely name. "Let me help," he offered, surprising himself with the sincerity of the request. Lauren laughed, a brief sound without humor. "Help how, Rick? Will you give me money? An allowance for your ex-wife fallen from grace? Or do you want to feel better about yourself for a few weeks, then return to your perfect life with your model?" "Girlfriend?" The words were harsh, but Rick noticed the almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. Behind the facade of strength and independence, there was exhaustion, fear, and perhaps a hint of desperation that she refused to admit. "It's not about that," he replied, with more gentleness than he intended. "You need to rest, Lauren. You need to take better care of yourself in these last weeks of pregnancy. Working as a waitress, climbing 4 flights of stairs every day, that's not healthy for you or the baby." "And what do you suggest?" she asked, with evident skepticism in her voice. "That I simply stop working. With what resources?" Rick hesitated. The proposal he was about to make was impulsive, irrational, completely out of his usual calculated and pragmatic behavior. Still, he felt compelled to make it. "Come to my place," he said finally, "just temporarily, until the baby is born. I have a guest room that's never used. You could rest, prepare properly for the birth." Lauren looked at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "You're inviting me to live with you?" she asked, incredulous. "After 4 years without contact? This is crazy, Rick." "It's practical," he argued, resorting to the language they both understood. "You need rest, I have space. It's a temporary solution to an immediate problem." "And your model girlfriend? What would she think of this?" "Victoria and we're taking a break," he replied, realizing it was true. They hadn't officially declared the end of the relationship, but both knew that something fundamental had changed since that night at the restaurant. Lauren leaned more heavily against the counter, closing her eyes for a moment. When she reopened them, there was a mixture of resignation and pragmatic calculation in her gaze. "You're serious," she stated. "You're really offering me temporary shelter." "I am," he confirmed. "Why?" she asked, with genuine curiosity. "Why now, Rick? Why care after all this time?" It was a question for which he himself didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't just guilt, although there was a portion of that. It wasn't longing or a desire for romantic reconciliation. It was something more complex, more primordial, a sense of responsibility perhaps, or a genuine desire to do the right thing for the first time in a long time. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. Lauren studied him for long seconds as if trying to unravel his true intentions in the contours of his face. Finally, another contraction of pain made her visibly shudder. "I have some conditions," she said, after catching her breath. "I'm listening. First, this is temporary until Sophie is born and I recover enough to return to work," she established firmly. "Second, I want to contribute financially. I don't want charity." "Lauren, you don't need to—" "Third," she interrupted, raising her hand. "There is no romantic or physical involvement between us. That ended 4 years ago. We are just acquaintances trying for a civilized coexistence for a greater good." The objectivity of the conditions didn't surprise Rick. It was typical of Lauren to establish clear boundaries, to define the terms of any agreement with precision. It was one of the qualities he had always admired in her. "I accept your conditions," he replied, formally extending his hand, as if they were closing a business contract. Lauren hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. The touch was brief, professional, devoid of the intimacy they had once shared. Still, Rick felt a strange sensation of relief at feeling her hand in his. "When would you like to move?" he asked, returning to the practical mode that was familiar to him. Lauren passed her hand over her belly in a protective gesture that Rick had already noticed several times. "I need to organize some things first," she replied, looking around the small apartment. "Maybe this weekend?" "Of course," he agreed. "I can help with the move." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. The proposal made and accepted, there remained the strange reality of the situation. Ex-spouses who hadn't seen each other for years, about to share the same roof again under completely different circumstances than they had shared in the past. "Well, I guess I'll be going now," said Rick, suddenly aware that he was invading her personal space. "You need to rest." Lauren nodded without protesting. She seemed relieved at his imminent departure, as if the interaction had drained her last reserves of energy. "Can I come on Saturday to help with the move?" he asked, heading to the door. "Yes," she replied, following him to the entrance. "I don't have much to take anyway." Rick hesitated at the threshold of the door, feeling that he should say something more but not knowing exactly what. The situation was so surreal, so outside the parameters of his carefully controlled life, that there was no etiquette manual or negotiation strategy that could guide him. "Until Saturday, then," he finally said. "Until Saturday," she echoed, gently closing the door as soon as he left. On the way back home, Rick tried to process what had just happened. He had offered shelter to his pregnant ex-wife, with whom he had had no contact for 4 years. He was about to share his personal space with her and a newborn. It was the kind of impulsive, emotional decision he had always avoided in his meticulously planned life. And yet, for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sensation of peace, as if he had finally found the right path after a long period of disorientation. Rick's Upper East Side penthouse had always been an impersonal space, closer to an interior design showroom than a proper home. The expensive furniture, chosen by a renowned decorator, seemed more like exhibition pieces than objects intended for daily use. The white walls displayed abstract paintings, selected more for their investment value than for any emotional connection. The stainless steel kitchen was rarely used for anything beyond heating food delivered by fine restaurants. That Saturday morning, however, The apartment seemed strangely different. Rick had spent the last few hours cleaning the guest room, changing. The Egyptian cotton sheets, emptying the closet to make room for Lauren's belongings. He had bought fresh flowers for the center table and stocked the refrigerator with fruits, vegetables, and other items he imagined a pregnant woman might need. The intercom rang promptly at 10 in the morning. Rick instinctively adjusted the collar of his polo shirt before answering. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," announced the doorman. "Ms. Lauren is here with a rideshare driver. May I let them up?" "Of course, Pete, thank you." While waiting for the elevator to arrive, Rick felt an unusual restlessness. He was accustomed to high-risk negotiations, decisive meetings with international investors, situations that would determine the future of his company. However, the prospect of receiving Lauren in his home generated a different, deeper anxiety that he couldn't adequately classify. When the elevator door opened, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. Lauren was there, with a small suitcase and some bags. The driver carried a cardboard box and what appeared to be a pregnancy pillow. The prominent belly under the simple cotton dress emphasized the strangeness of that moment. "Good morning," Rick greeted, trying to sound casual while holding the door. "Let me help with that." He took the box from the driver's hands, thanked him, and paid a generous tip. When they were finally alone in the apartment, an awkward silence settled between them. "Well, this is the place," he said unnecessarily, making a vague gesture with his free hand. "I'll show you the room." Lauren followed him down the hall, observing the environment with contained curiosity. The guest room was spacious, with a queen-size bed, a minimalist desk, and a comfortable armchair near the window that offered a partial view of Central Park. "The bathroom is there," Rick indicated, pointing to an adjacent door. "There are clean towels in the cabinet and, well, if you need anything else, just ask." Lauren placed the suitcase on the bed and looked around, as if evaluating a hotel room. "It's perfect," she finally said. "Thank you." Another silence. Rick realized that both were following an unwritten script of formality, like strangers trying to navigate unknown territory. "I prepared breakfast," he offered, "if you're hungry." Lauren seemed genuinely surprised. "You cooked?" "Not exactly," Rick admitted with a hesitant smile. "I bought bread, fruits, cheeses. I can make eggs if you want." "Just coffee for now," she replied. "I'll unpack first." "Of course," he agreed, retreating to the door. "Make yourself at home. The house is, well, you know." While preparing coffee in the kitchen, Rick reflected on how surreal the whole situation was. 4 years ago, when they signed the divorce papers in the cold lawyer's office, he could never have imagined that one day they would be there, sharing the same space again under such different circumstances. The soft sound of footsteps announced Lauren's arrival in the kitchen. She had changed the dress for a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, a look that accentuated her condition even more. She sat on the high stool at the counter, distractedly watching Rick handle the Italian coffee maker with more skill than she expected. "Decaffeinated," he explained, noticing her look. "I read that pregnant women should avoid excess caffeine." Lauren raised her eyebrows, surprised again. "You researched pregnancy?" "Just the basics," he replied, feeling strangely embarrassed. It seemed appropriate, considering the situation. He served the coffee in an elegant cup and gently pushed it toward her, along with a plate of freshly cut fruits. "Thank you," said Lauren, taking a cautious sip. "It's good." "I'm glad," Rick replied, serving himself as well, more to have something to do with his hands than out of a real desire to drink coffee. The silence that followed wasn't exactly comfortable, but neither was it as tense as before. It was a silence of adjustment, of recalibration, of two people trying to find a new rhythm of coexistence. "So," Rick finally began, "how are you feeling today?" "Tired," Lauren replied with honesty. "The last weeks are the most difficult. Everything hurts, I can't sleep properly, and Sophie seems determined to use my ribs as a trampoline." There was a disconcerting intimacy in the way she talked about the pregnancy, an experience that Rick only knew in theory through articles hastily read on the internet in recent days. "Do you have everything prepared?" For when she's born, I mean? He asked, genuinely interested. Lauren shrugged, a gesture that mixed resignation and pragmatism. The basics. Diapers, some clothes, a simple crib that I left in the apartment. I'll pick it up when I go back there. You can bring it here, Rick impulsively offered. The crib, there's enough space in the room. Lauren studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his true intentions. That wasn't in the initial agreement, she observed. It's just practical, he argued. If you're going to stay here until you recover from childbirth, it makes sense for the baby to have a proper place to sleep. Lauren didn't respond immediately, taking another sip of coffee while considering the proposal. All right, she finally conceded. I'll call a friend, see if she can bring the crib. The days that followed established a strangely domestic routine between them. Rick woke up early, prepared breakfast, a skill he was rapidly developing, and left a thermos with chamomile tea for Lauren before leaving for work. He returned earlier than usual, often bringing fresh fruits or some item he had researched to be beneficial for pregnant women. The nights were spent in a silent but not uncomfortable coexistence. They had dinner together, sometimes talking about superficial subjects, other times just appreciating the shared silence. Afterwards, each retreated to their own space, Rick usually to the office where he worked until late, and Lauren to the guest room where she read or watched series on her tablet. Lauren's presence subtly altered the dynamics of the apartment. Small personal objects began to appear in common spaces. A book about motherhood on the center table, a cardigan forgotten on the sofa, a pair of comfortable slippers next to the door. The impersonal space gradually gained traces of domesticity that Rick hadn't realized were missing. On Thursday, the crib arrived, brought by Julie, a friend of Lauren who looked at Rick with barely disguised suspicion. After helping them assemble the furniture in the guest room, she pulled Lauren into the hallway, whispering in a tone that Rick could partially hear from the kitchen. Are you sure this is a good idea, living with your ex-husband? It's temporary, Lauren replied firmly, and practical. You saw how difficult it was to climb those stairs every day. I just don't want you to get hurt again, Julie insisted. He left you once, Lo. What guarantees he won't do it again when you need him most? Lauren's response was too low for Rick to hear, but the tone was resolute. When the two returned to the living room, Julie said goodbye formally, making it clear with her look that she would be closely monitoring the situation. That night, after dinner, while Lauren organized some baby items that Julie had brought, Rick realized that he hadn't attended the dinner with the Chinese investors that Charles had mentioned days earlier. He hadn't even remembered the commitment. He picked up his cell phone and saw 5 missed calls and a dozen messages from his partner. The most recent simply said, "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., office." Rick sighed, anticipating the difficult conversation ahead. Charles wasn't just his partner, but also a close friend who knew him too well to accept vague excuses. "Problems?" asked Lauren, noticing his worried expression. "Nothing serious," he replied, putting the phone away. "Just forgot a work commitment." Lauren studied him for a moment, with that scrutinizing look that always made him feel transparent. "That's not typical of you," she observed, "forgetting work commitments." "Things change," he replied simply. The next morning, he arrived at the office prepared for Charles's reprimand. His partner was waiting for him in the main conference room, with a grave expression and a folder of documents on the table. "The Chinese weren't happy with your absence," Charles began, without preamble. "I managed to smooth the situation, but they interpreted it as a lack of interest. We lost crucial ground in the negotiations." "I'll call personally to apologize," Rick offered, "possibly reschedule a private dinner with Mr. Zhang." Charles studied him for a moment, assessing. "What's happening to you, Rick? First the situation with Victoria, now forgotten commitments. This isn't you." Rick considered several possible responses, all evasive, all insufficient. Finally, he opted for the truth, or part of it. "I'm going through some personal changes," he admitted. "Nothing that will permanently affect the company, I promise." "Victoria mentioned something about your ex-wife," Charles commented, closely observing his reaction. "Said you found her at a restaurant, pregnant." Rick imperceptibly stiffened. The last thing he wanted was his personal life being discussed in the social circles he and Charles shared. "Yes," he briefly confirmed, "we reconnected." "And now?" "Now I'm temporarily helping her," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. "She's in the last month of pregnancy, working in less than ideal conditions. I offered a room in my house until the baby is born." Charles widened his eyes, genuinely surprised. "You're living with your pregnant ex-wife? With another man's child?" Put that way, the situation sounded even more surreal than Rick already considered it. "It's a matter of basic human responsibility." He defended himself, feeling strangely defensive. "She has no family in New York. The child's father is not present, and she was working as a waitress, standing for hours, 8 months pregnant." Charles raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not judging, Rick. I'm just concerned. This is a significant deviation from your usual behavior." "Maybe it's time for some deviations," Rick replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. The rest of the meeting was dedicated to strategies to recover the lost ground with the Chinese investors. Rick was fully present, offering ideas and solutions with his usual competence. But something had subtly changed in the dynamics between the partners, an imperceptible distance, a silent questioning hanging in the air. When he returned to the apartment that afternoon, he found Lauren sleeping on the living room sofa, an open book on her lap. He approached silently, observing her relaxed face in sleep. There was a vulnerability in her asleep that contrasted with the strength she always demonstrated awake. Gently, he removed the book from her lap and covered her with a light blanket he kept in the hallway closet. The soft movement made her stir, but not fully awaken. "Rick," she murmured sleepily. "Shh, keep sleeping," he replied softly. "I'm just getting home." She nodded vaguely and relaxed again. Rick remained there for a moment, watching her breathe. Softly, the belly rising and falling in a constant rhythm. A strange feeling of protection invaded him, an instinct he didn't know he possessed. Careful not to make noise, he went to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. He wasn't an experienced cook, but in recent weeks he had learned some basic dishes mainly. Researching healthy recipes for pregnant women. While cutting vegetables for a simple ratatouille, he reflected on the conversation with Charles. His partner was right on one point. Rick was changing. His priorities, which had always been crystalline, the company first always, now seemed less defined, more fluid. The sound of soft footsteps announced Lauren's arrival in the kitchen. She seemed more rested, with her hair slightly disheveled from sleep, and the marks of the sofa temporarily imprinted on her cheek. "You're cooking," she observed, with a slight tone of surprise that still emerged whenever she saw him performing. "Domestic tasks. Trying to," he corrected with a self-ironic smile. "Ratatouille and grilled chicken. I read that colorful vegetables are good at this stage of pregnancy." Lauren leaned on the counter, watching him handle the knife with excessive care. "You've really been researching a lot," she commented. "Seems like the minimum to do," he replied, without taking his eyes off the vegetables. "I want to really help, not just offer a roof." A comfortable silence settled between them as Rick continued to prepare the meal, and Lauren occasionally offered tips or suggestions. There was a domesticity in that scene that neither had experienced during the marriage, always too busy with their respective careers to share simple moments like that. "How was your day?" Rick asked when they finally sat at the rarely used dining room table. "Quiet," she replied, tasting the ratatouille with evident appreciation. "Read a lot, slept a little, talked to my doctor about the next appointment." "When is it?" "Monday." "It's the last one before the expected date for the birth." Rick hesitated for a moment. "Would you like me to accompany you?" he offered, surprising them both. Lauren raised her eyes from the plate, assessing the sincerity of the offer. "It's not necessary," she replied cautiously. "I know you have work commitments." "I can reorganize my schedule," he insisted. "If you want company, of course." Something subtly changed in her expression, an almost imperceptible softening, a brief relaxation of the carefully maintained barriers. "It would be useful," she finally admitted. "The appointment is at 2 p.m. "I'll be available," he assured. They continued dining in silence, but it was a different silence now, more comfortable, more familiar. as if a small but significant barrier had been removed between them. After dinner, while Lauren rested on the sofa, Rick received a message from Victoria. It was the first time she had contacted him directly since the dinner at Luminous. "Back from Milan, can we talk? Tomorrow breakfast at Botanical Brew?" Rick stared at the message for long seconds, feeling a strange emotional distance, as if that relationship belonged to another life, another version of himself. "Sure," he finally replied. "9 a.m. works." The response came almost immediately. "Perfect. See you tomorrow." When he looked up from his phone, he realized that Lauren was observing him with a neutral expression, but attentive eyes. "Victoria?" she asked without accusation, in her voice just stating a fact. Rick nodded, seeing no reason to deny. "She's back from Milan, wants to talk tomorrow." "You should go," said Lauren, returning her attention to the book in her lap. "You need to properly resolve things." There was a practical wisdom in her words that Rick had always appreciated, even in the most difficult moments of the marriage. Lauren always saw situations with clarity, without the emotional filters that often clouded people's judgment. "Yes," he agreed, "we need to." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Botanical Brew occupied the ground floor of a restored historic building in Williamsburg. With its exposed brick walls, recycled wood furniture, and a profusion of plants hanging from the ceiling, the place had become a meeting point for New York's intellectual and business elite. Rick arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, as was his custom. Victoria, surprisingly, was already waiting for him at a table in the back, partially hidden by a large fern. When she saw him approach, she looked up from her cell phone and smiled, a contained, diplomatic smile that didn't fully reach her blue eyes. She was impeccable as always, perfectly styled blonde hair, makeup that enhanced her features without seeming excessive, a caramel-toned linen shirt dress that probably cost more than the monthly salary of many of those present in the cafe. Punctual. "As always," she commented when Rick sat across from her. "Some things don't change," he replied with a half smile. A waiter approached immediately, and both placed their orders, a double espresso for Rick, a matcha latte with almond milk for Victoria. When they were alone again, a strange silence settled between them. "How was Milan?" Rick finally asked, resorting to the social conversation that had always been easy between them. "Productive," she replied, adjusting the napkin in her lap with unnecessary precision. "The campaign was a success. They're talking about renewing the contract for 2 more seasons." "That's great," he replied, with genuine appreciation. He had always admired Victoria's dedication to her career, the methodical way she built her image and expanded her presence in the competitive world of fashion. Another silence. The orders arrived, offering a brief distraction. Victoria sweetened her matcha with a precise drop of organic honey, stirring 3 times clockwise, a ritual that Rick had observed dozens of times and that now seemed to belong to a distant routine from another life. "So," she began, after a small sip, "I heard some interesting rumors while I was away." Rick maintained a neutral expression, although he already knew exactly where the conversation was going. "What kind of rumors?" "That you're living with your ex-wife," Victoria replied directly, her eyes studying every nuance of his reaction. "That she's 8 months pregnant, that you found her working as a waitress at Luminous. The details vary a bit depending on who's telling the story, but the core seems consistent." Rick took a sip of his espresso, gaining a few seconds to formulate his response. There was no surprise in the fact that the news had spread. New York might be a metropolis of millions, but the social and business circle in which he moved was small and incestuously connected. "The rumors are basically correct," he admitted, seeing little value in denials or half-truths. "Lauren is temporarily living with me. She's in the last month of pregnancy and needed a more suitable environment than the apartment without an elevator where she was." Victoria studied him for long seconds, her face a mask of almost perfect emotional control. Almost. "And this happened when exactly? The day after our dinner at Luminous?" "No," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "It took a few weeks. I observed her, saw the situation she was in, offered help." "You observed her?" Victoria repeated with a slight tone of incredulity. Like a charity project. The question had a thread of acidity that Rick had never detected in Victoria before. She had always been the definition of self-control, practical, rational, without excessive emotional demonstrations. It was one of the qualities he most appreciated in her. "It's not charity," he replied with more firmness than he intended. "It's responsibility." "Responsibility," Victoria echoed, thoughtfully twirling the spoon in her cup. "For what, exactly?" "She's pregnant with another man's child, Rick. You've been divorced for 4 years. What responsibility could you have?" It was a fair question, Rick had to admit. The same one he himself had asked countless times in recent weeks, without coming to a completely satisfactory answer. "Some responsibilities transcend legal contracts," he finally replied. "Lauren was important in my life. We have a history. I can't simply ignore when she needs help." Victoria nodded slowly, as if assimilating not only his words, but also what was between the lines. "I understand," she said after a moment. "And where does that leave us? You and me?" The question hung between them, direct and inevitable. Rick felt a mixture of admiration for Victoria's frankness and a strange relief at finally addressing the topic that both had avoided in recent weeks. "I don't know," he admitted with an honesty that surprised them both. "Everything happened so quickly. My life turned upside down in a matter of weeks." "You still have feelings for her," Victoria observed. It wasn't a question, but a serene statement. Rick hesitated. Feelings for Lauren. What he felt was too complex to be easily categorized. It wasn't romantic love, at least not in the conventional sense. It wasn't just guilt or responsibility. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition of connection that transcended simple definitions. "It's complicated," he finally replied. Victoria smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "You know what's not complicated? This," she said, making a gesture that encompassed the two. "We've always been simple, Rick, compatible, efficient together. No drama, no excessive emotional complications." "Is that bad?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Not necessarily," Victoria replied thoughtfully. "It worked for us for 8 months. Maybe it could work for much longer, but it would never be transformative, and something tells me that's exactly what you're experiencing now, a transformation." There was an insight in her words that surprised him. Victoria had always been observant, analytical, capable of assessing situations with impressive clarity, but she had rarely directed that ability toward such deep emotional issues. "I think you're right," he agreed, after a moment of reflection. "I'm changing, or maybe just rediscovering parts of me that have been dormant for a long time. And I'm not part of that journey," she completed without bitterness, just stating a fact. "Victoria, It's all right, Rick," she interrupted, lightly placing her hand on his. "Really, I think we always knew, on some level, that our relationship had an expiration date. It was good, convenient, pleasant, but it was never essential." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Essential. That was exactly what Rick felt regarding the situation with Lauren, an essentiality, a fundamental need that he had never experienced in his relationship with Victoria. "I'm sorry," he said with sincerity. "Me too," she replied, removing her hand and leaning back in her chair. "But I prefer that we end like this, with honesty and mutual respect, than dragging something that no longer makes sense." The rest of breakfast proceeded in a surprisingly friendly atmosphere. They talked about their respective work, exchanged opinions on recent news, even laughed at some shared memories. It was as if with the tacit decision to end the relationship, a new form of connection could begin to flourish, less romantic, but no less genuine. When they said goodbye on the sidewalk in front of the cafe, Victoria briefly hugged him. "I sincerely wish that you find what you're looking for, Rick," she said, "whatever it may be." "You also deserve someone for whom you are essential," he replied with equal sincerity. She smiled, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and turned to enter the car that was waiting for her. Rick watched her leave, feeling a strange mixture of relief and gratitude. The end of his relationship with Victoria had been so civilized, so adult, so painless, completely different from the emotional storm that had been his divorce from Lauren. As he walked to his own car, he reflected on the contrast. Perhaps the difference was precisely in the depth of involvement. With Victoria, everything had been pleasant, simple, without great emotional waves. With Lauren, even in the best moments, there had always been intensity, both in joy and in pain. And now, strangely, he was reliving part of that intensity, albeit in a completely different way. Not as husband and wife, but as two people connected by a shared history, trying to navigate a new reality together. When he returned to the apartment, he found Lauren in the kitchen, preparing an herbal tea. She raised her eyes when he entered, a silent question in her gaze. "We broke up," Rick said simply, answering the unformulated question. "In a friendly way?" Lauren nodded without showing surprise. "That's good," she commented, returning her attention to the tea. "Friendly breakup is rare." "Different from ours," he observed, unable to contain the comment. A brief ironic smile crossed her lips. "Very different," she agreed, "but we were different people then. Young, proud, stubborn." "Especially me," Rick admitted, surprising them, both with this spontaneous confession. Lauren studied him for a moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "We both made mistakes," she finally said, with a generosity he didn't expect. "I was also inflexible, too demanding. I wanted everything at once, career, family, stability, without understanding the necessary sacrifices." It was the first time they really talked about the past since they had re-entered each other's lives. The first time they looked back without anger or resentment, just with the clarity that time and maturity had brought. "I think I never really understood how much you wanted a child," Rick confessed, leaning on the kitchen counter. "For me, it was something that could wait, that we could carefully plan when our careers were established. I didn't realize that for you it was something more visceral. And I never fully understood your need for financial security before taking that step," she replied, serving the tea in 2 cups. "I thought it was just ambition, when in fact it was fear of not being able to provide stability." She offered one of the cups to Rick, who accepted with a silent thank you. It was chamomile with lavender, relaxing, soft, comforting. "And now you'll have your daughter," he observed after a sip. "Yes," Lauren replied, passing her hand over her belly in a gesture that had become familiar to Rick. "In completely different circumstances than I imagined, but yes." There was a trace of vulnerability in her voice that he rarely noticed. Lauren always presented herself as strong, independent, capable of dealing with any adversity. But in that moment, he glimpsed the uncertainty and fear that she carefully kept hidden. "You'll be an amazing mother," he said with genuine conviction. She raised her eyes, surprised by the comment. "How can you be so sure? You've never seen me interacting with children." "I know you," he replied simply. "For your strength, your determination, your capacity to love intensely, Sophie will be a lucky girl." Something softened in Lauren's expression, a rare vulnerability, an openness that he hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship. "Thank you," she said, almost in a whisper. "That means a lot." The moment was interrupted by the ring of Rick's cell phone. It was Charles Reynolds, his partner, probably wanting to discuss some aspect of the meeting with the Chinese investors. At any other time, Rick would have answered immediately. Business always came first. Today, however, he silenced the phone and put it in his pocket. "Aren't you going to answer?" asked Lauren, genuinely surprised. "I can call back later," he replied, taking another sip of tea. "Some things are more important." The look Lauren gave him contained a mixture of surprise and something he couldn't completely identify, admiration perhaps, or just the observation of a change she hadn't expected to witness. The rest of the day proceeded in a strange domestic harmony. They had lunch together, talking about light subjects. Then, while Lauren rested, Rick worked on his laptop, responding to emails and reviewing documents, but from the living room, not locked in his office as he used to do. In the late afternoon, when the golden light of the New York sunset filtered through the penthouse windows, Lauren emerged from the room with a worried expression. "Everything okay?" Rick immediately asked, noticing her restlessness. "I'm feeling some contractions," she replied, massaging the side of her belly. "Probably just Braxton Hicks. I've been feeling some in the last few weeks." "Are you sure? Shouldn't we go to the hospital?" Lauren smiled at his evident concern. "Not yet," she assured. "They're irregular and not very strong. The doctor said, 'This is normal at this stage. I just need to monitor them.'" Even with her assurances, Rick couldn't return to concentrating on work. He observed Lauren discreetly, noticing each time she paused in her reading, each time she adjusted her position. On the sofa, each expression of discomfort that crossed her face. "You're staring at me," she finally commented, without raising her eyes from the book. "Sorry," he replied, feeling embarrassed like a teenager caught in the act. "I'm worried." Lauren closed the book and looked at him with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant affection. "Rick, women have been having babies for thousands of years. It's a natural process. You don't need to watch me like I'm a bomb about to explode." "Sorry," he repeated with an embarrassed smile. "It's all new to me." "For me too," she admitted with a sigh. "But I've been reading a lot. I know what to expect." "And what should we expect now?" he asked, genuinely interested. "A few more weeks of increasing discomfort, probably," she replied, with a pragmatism he had always admired. "The due date is 16 days from now, but it can happen before or after. When labor really begins, the contractions will be regular, increasingly stronger and closer. Then it will be time to go to the hospital." The methodical, almost scientific way in which she described the process brought a strange comfort to Rick. Typical of Lauren to approach even the birth of a child with the same organization and planning she applied to professional projects. "And do you want me to be present?" "At the hospital, I mean," he asked hesitantly. Lauren seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Do you want to be present?" "If you want me to be," he replied, feeling strangely vulnerable. "I don't want to impose my presence, but I also don't want you to go through this alone." Lauren studied him for long seconds, as if trying to decipher a particularly complex enigma. "You really have changed," she finally observed. "For the better, I hope," he replied, with a hesitant smile. "For different," she corrected without judgment. "The Rick I knew would never offer to stay in a delivery room. Too much blood, too much chaos, too much out of his control." There was truth in her words. The old Rick, obsessed with control and order, would have avoided such an unpredictable and emotionally charged situation as childbirth. He would have offered financial, logistical, practical support, but maintaining safe emotional distance. "People change," he said simply. "Yes," she agreed, with a contemplative look. "Apparently they do." That night, during dinner, Rick's cell phone rang again. It was Charles for the third time that day. Reluctantly, he answered, imagining it must be something urgent. "Rick," Charles's voice sounded tense even through the speakerphone. "We need to talk. The Chinese are reconsidering the entire deal after your absence yesterday, and the board is questioning your recent commitment to the company." "We can resolve this," Rick replied, trying to keep his voice calm while looking at Lauren, who pretended not to be listening. "Not over the phone," Charles insisted. "It needs to be in person. Tomorrow, extraordinary board meeting, 8 a.m. It's important, Rick, crucial." "I'll be there," he assured, ending the call. The silence that followed was laden with unspoken tension. Finally, Lauren spoke. "Problems. At work because of me," she observed, not as a question but as a statement. "Not because of you," he corrected, "because of my choices. And they're manageable problems." "I don't want to be responsible for harming your career, Rick," she said. "Seriously. You've built something important. You shouldn't put that at risk." "Some things are more important than business," he replied, surprising himself with his own conviction. "You never believed that before," she observed, with a trace of skepticism. "Maybe I was wrong before," he admitted, holding her gaze. Lauren didn't respond immediately, but something subtly changed in her expression, a softening, a silent recognition of the transformation she was witnessing. The headquarters of Bennett and Reynolds Imports occupied 3 floors of a modern business building on Madison Avenue. Normally, Rick felt a wave of satisfaction upon entering the marble-floored lobby and heading to the private elevators, conscious that he had built that empire from scratch with impeccable determination and strategy. That morning, however, as the elevator silently rose to the 20th floor, he experienced a strange feeling of detachment. The mirrored walls reflected his image: impeccable suit, erect posture, Italian leather briefcase in hand, but he wondered if the people awaiting him in the meeting room would notice the internal transformation that had occurred in recent weeks. The main meeting room was already occupied when he arrived. 8 board members and Charles Reynolds awaited him. Serious faces, untouched coffee cups on the polished mahogany table. The silence that settled with his entrance had an almost tangible weight. "Good morning, gentlemen," Rick greeted, with the serenity that always characterized him in pressure situations. Charles stood up, involuntarily assuming the role of spokesperson for the group. "Rick, thank you for coming," he began, with unusual formality between them. "As we briefly discussed yesterday, the board has called this meeting to discuss recent concerns about your commitment to the company." Rick nodded, without showing surprise or discomfort. He placed his briefcase on the table and remained standing, preferring to face the scrutiny in a position of equality. "I understand the concern," he replied with a firm voice, "and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the situation." Edward Morgan, the oldest board member, leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table. "Rick, we've always admired your dedication and strategic vision," he began, with the paternal tone he frequently adopted. "But in recent months, especially in recent weeks, we've noticed concerning changes. Forgotten commitments, missed meetings, delayed decisions. And the incident with the Chinese investors," added Marcus Bradley, another board member, "was particularly alarming. You had never missed a negotiation of this magnitude before." Rick looked at each of those present, recognizing the legitimacy of their concerns. These men and women had invested not only money, but trust in his leadership. They deserved honesty. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began with a calmness that surprised even himself, "I won't deny that I'm going through significant personal changes. Recently, I reconnected with my ex-wife in unexpected circumstances. She's about to give birth and faces difficulties. I offered temporary support, which has required adjustments in my routine." A murmur ran through the table. Charles, who already knew part of the story, remained silent, closely observing the reactions of the board members. "We understand personal situations," intervened Patricia Vaughan, one of the few women on the board, "but the question is whether these circumstances will continue affecting your professional performance." The question hung in the air, direct and inevitable. A few weeks ago, Rick would have immediately responded with emphatic guarantees that nothing, absolutely nothing, would interfere with his commitment to the company. Business always came first. That had been his mantra for years, the philosophy that had guided every decision in his life. Today, however, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but from the need. To be completely honest, with the board and with himself, "What I can guarantee," he finally replied, "is that I will continue giving my best to this company we built together. But it would be dishonest to promise that nothing has changed. I've changed. My priorities are adjusting." The silence that followed was dense, laden with surprise and apprehension. Charles frowned, clearly concerned with the direction of the conversation. "Rick," he intervened, trying to smooth the moment, "perhaps what the board needs to hear is a concrete plan. How do you intend to balance these new priorities with your responsibilities here?" It was a lifeline, an opportunity to reaffirm his commitment to the company in terms acceptable to all. The old Rick would have immediately taken advantage, promising that any personal distraction would be strictly temporary and controlled. But as he considered his response, an image arose in his mind. Lauren that morning, calmly preparing tea. In the kitchen, the prominent belly, the tired but serene face. The way her eyes met his when he announced he was going to the meeting, without judgment. Just a silent acceptance of the man he had always been, of the man who prioritized business above all. "What I propose," said Rick, surprising everyone, with the firmness in his voice, is a period of temporary leave. Leave? Repeated Edward, clearly shocked. You want to leave the presidency? Temporarily, Rick clarified, for 3 months. Time enough to support Lauren in the birth of the child and in the first moments of motherhood. Time enough to reassess my life priorities and return with renewed clarity. The proposal was met with astonished expressions. Rick Bennett, the tireless workaholic, the man who answered emails at 3 in the morning and conducted conference calls during intercontinental flights, voluntarily proposing to step away from the command of the company that was practically synonymous with his identity. Charles is fully capable of assuming the interim presidency, continued Rick, indicating his partner with a respectful gesture. I'll maintain regular communication. I'll be available for consultations on critical decisions, but the day-to-day will be in his competent hands. Charles seemed divided between shock and a kind of reluctant pride. They had built the company together, from the first modest contracts to the international powerhouse it was today. He always knew he was Rick's capable right-hand man, but never imagined seeing him voluntarily ceding control, even temporarily. If I may be frank, said Patricia, breaking the tense silence, this is possibly the most mature decision I've ever seen you make, Rick. The unexpected comment made all eyes turn to her. I've known Rick for almost a decade, she continued, with the quiet authority that characterized her. I've seen his brilliant strategic capability, his tireless determination, his meticulous attention to detail, but I've also seen the personal cost of these qualities. We all have. Several board members nodded silently. It was an open secret that Rick's personal life had often been sacrificed on the altar of business success. His failed marriage, superficial relationships, few genuine friendships outside the professional circle. Recognizing the need for balance isn't weakness, concluded Patricia. It's evolution. And if Rick returns after these 3 months with a more balanced perspective, we'll have a leader who is not only brilliant, but complete. Patricia's unexpected support changed the tone of the meeting. Other board members began to express similar opinions, recognizing that the proposal, although surprising, showed maturity and responsibility. 2 hours later, when Rick left the building, the temporary leave had been unanimously approved. Charles would assume the interim presidency, with Rick remaining available for consultations on strategic decisions. While driving back home, to Lauren, he felt a strange lightness. For the first time in many years, he wasn't racing against the clock, wasn't mentally organizing the next meeting, the next negotiation, the next obstacle to overcome. He was simply present. Upon entering the apartment, he found Lauren sitting on the balcony, enjoying the mild morning sun while leafing through a book about newborn care. She raised her eyes when she heard him approach, a silent question in her gaze. I requested temporary leave from the presidency, he announced without preamble. Lauren slowly closed the book, genuinely surprised. Because of me? She asked, with a mixture of incredulity and concern. Because of me, he corrected, sitting in the chair next to her. Because of Sophie. Because of us. Because of what we're building here. And what exactly are we building, Rick? She asked, with the direct frankness that had always been her trademark. It was a fair question. In the weeks of coexistence, they had developed a comfortable routine, rediscovered an emotional intimacy that transcended the romantic past, but had never really discussed what that meant, where they were heading. I don't know exactly, he admitted, with an honesty that the old Rick would have considered dangerous. I only know that it's important, more important than any negotiation, any contract, any international expansion. Lauren studied him for long seconds, as if trying to see beyond the surface, beyond the impeccable businessman she had known, to the core of the person he was becoming. You really have changed, she finally observed. I'm still changing, he corrected with a hesitant smile. It's a process. She nodded, understanding. They remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what was happening between them. Not a romantic reconciliation in the traditional sense, but a deeper reconnection, a reunion of souls that had followed separate paths only to discover that they were somehow destined to cross again. "Oh!" Lauren suddenly exclaimed, bringing her hand to her belly with an expression of surprise. "What is it?" asked Rick, alarmed. "Contractions." "No, no," she reassured with a smile. "Sophie is kicking, hard. Want to feel?" Before he could respond, she took his hand and placed it on her belly. For a moment nothing happened. Then, as if responding to the touch, a gentle undulation moved beneath his fingers, a small foot or elbow pressing against the wall of the maternal womb. The sensation hit Rick like an electric shock. Life. A real complete life, with its own rhythm and will growing inches from his hand. His eyes met Lauren's, sharing a moment of silent amazement at the everyday miracle they were witnessing. "Amazing," he murmured, without removing his hand. "She's been doing this a lot lately," Lauren commented, with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "Especially at night. I think she's going to be a night owl like you." The casual observation, the first time Lauren had suggested that Sophie might inherit any characteristic from him, made Rick feel an unexpected wave of emotion. He wasn't the biological father of that child, but at that moment, feeling her movements beneath his hand, a connection was forming. And connection that transcended blood or DNA. The days that followed brought a new routine for both. Without the constant pressures of the presidency, Rick rediscovered the pleasure of simple moments. Prolonged breakfast with Lauren, discussions about baby names, even a joint visit to the obstetrician, where he heard for the first time the accelerated heartbeats of Sophie. Lauren, in turn, seemed to gradually relax, allowing herself to accept the support he offered without seeing it as a threat to her hard-won independence. Together, they prepared the room for Sophie's arrival. Not the guest room, but a space adjacent to Rick's office that he voluntarily converted into a cozy nursery. Charles occasionally called for consultations on important company decisions, but respected Rick's leave. In one of these conversations, he casually commented, "You sound different. Even your voice is more relaxed." "I feel different," Rick admitted, as if I were seeing the world through another lens. "Patricia was right. Then," observed Charles, "you're evolving." The statement stayed with Rick long after the end of the call. Evolution. That was exactly what was happening. Not a forced or artificial change, but a natural development, a growth toward a more complete, more integrated version of himself, fast. The morning of a rainy Wednesday, 2 weeks after the beginning of his leave, Rick woke to the sound of Lauren calling his name. Her voice, normally controlled, had a tone of urgency that made him rise instantly. "Rick, I think it started." He found her in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, breathing deeply. A small puddle of water was forming at her feet. "My water broke," she explained with surprising calmness. "And the contractions are regular, every 8 minutes approximately." Rick felt a wave of adrenaline. Despite all the research, all the conversations with the doctor, all the meticulous planning, the real moment caught him completely unprepared. For an instant he was paralyzed, his analytical mind trying to process all the details simultaneously. "Rick," Lauren called, pulling him out of the trance with a gentle touch on his arm. "Breathe. I've already packed the bag with everything." I just need you to take me to the hospital. We can do this." The confidence in her voice, the quiet strength in her eyes, even while facing the beginning of labor, awakened something in Rick. If she could maintain her composure at this moment, he certainly could do his part. "We can do this," he repeated, finding his own strength. "Let's go." The journey to the hospital was surreal. Rick drove with doubled attention, conscious of the preciousness of his cargo. Beside him, Lauren breathed methodically through the contractions, occasionally squeezing his hand when a particularly strong wave hit her. At the maternity reception, they were greeted by Dr. Hannah Mitchell, the obstetrician they had consulted together. After a quick examination, she confirmed, "It's progressing well. 4 centimeters of dilation. Now we just wait." The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Rick remained by Lauren's side throughout the process, offering water, massaging her back during the most intense contractions, letting her squeeze his hand until almost cutting off circulation when the pain became almost unbearable. "You don't have to stay," she said at one point, between labored breaths. "I know this isn't comfortable to watch." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied with a certainty that surprised them both. "We're in this together." When the moment finally came to push, Rick felt simultaneously terrified and amazed. Lauren's determination, the primitive strength she demonstrated, the raw vulnerability mixed with absolute power, it was the most impressive thing he had ever witnessed. "I see the head," announced Dr. Mitchell. "A little more, Lauren. You're doing very well." With one last heroic effort, Lauren brought Sophie into the world. The newborn's sharp cry filled the room, overriding all other sounds. Rick felt something break inside him, a barrier, a resistance he didn't even know still existed. Tears he hadn't shed in years flowed freely as he watched the small creature, red and indignant, being placed on Lauren's chest. "She's perfect," Lauren whispered, exhausted but radiant. "Look at her, Rick. She's simply perfect." And she was. Tiny, wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair stuck to her scalp, Sophie was the most extraordinary vision Rick had ever contemplated. When the nurse asked if he would like to hold her after she was cleaned and evaluated, Rick merely nodded, unable to articulate words through the emotion that dominated him. Later, when Lauren was resting in the private room he had arranged, Rick sat beside her, observing mother and daughter asleep. A deep peace enveloped him, different from anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the fleeting satisfaction of a successful business or the ephemeral pleasure of a luxury acquisition. It was something more fundamental, more permanent, a belonging, a purpose, a connection to something greater than himself. Lauren opened her eyes, as if feeling his gaze. "What are you thinking?" she asked sleepily. "How lucky we are." He replied with simplicity, "How life sometimes takes us exactly where we need to be, even when we take the wrong paths." She smiled, extending her hand to him, which he gently took between his. "I think we needed those 4 years apart," she observed, "to grow, to understand what really matters. To evolve," he added, remembering Charles's words. "Yes," she agreed, looking at Sophie, who slept peacefully in her hospital bassinet. "To evolve." They remained silent for a few moments, simply appreciating each other's presence, the new life they had brought into the world, the uncertain but possibility-filled future that opened before them. "What happens now?" Lauren finally asked, voicing the question that hung between them. Rick carefully considered before responding. The old Rick would have had a detailed plan, a clear strategy, defined objectives. The new Rick was learning to live with uncertainties, to value the process as much as the result. "I don't know exactly," he admitted without discomfort. "I only know that I want to be present. For Sophie, for you if you allow. The rest, we'll discover together." Lauren studied his face for long seconds, as if looking for something in the lines of his expression. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she smiled, a full smile without reservations, the first of its kind she had directed at him in many years. "Together," she repeated, squeezing his hand. "I like how that sounds." That night, while Lauren and Sophie slept, Rick remained awake in the armchair of the hospital room, contemplating the extraordinary twists life could take. Just 2 months ago, he was an executive obsessed with control and success, living a carefully planned but strangely empty existence. Now he was there, watching over the sleep of 2 people who had completely redefined his concept of success, of purpose, of happiness. The unexpected reunion with Lauren had been just the beginning. The real miracle was the reunion with himself, with parts of his soul he had neglected for so long in his relentless pursuit of external conquests. Sophie stirred in the bassinet, making small sounds of contentment in her sleep. Rick smiled, amazed at how such a tiny creature could exert such a transformative power over the world around her. He didn't know exactly what the future held. He didn't know if he and Lauren would eventually rebuild a romantic relationship or remain just partners in raising Sophie. He didn't know how he would balance his new priorities with his career when he returned to the company, presidency. But for the first time in a long time, perhaps for the first time in his life, the uncertainty didn't disturb him. He had discovered that some questions don't need immediate answers. Some journeys are more valuable for the path traveled than for the final destination. As the sun began to rise, filtering softly through the curtains of the hospital room, Rick contemplated the new day with a clarity he had never experienced before. The man who once believed that success was a simple equation of money, reputation, and power, now understood a much deeper truth. True success was in human connections, in embraced vulnerability, in the capacity to grow and change even when it would be easier to remain the same. Lauren opened her eyes, meeting his gaze across the dawn-illuminated room. "Good morning," she murmured. "Good morning," he replied, with a genuine smile.